really does impact on grandparents, on siblings. And I think even for siblings, it's that realisation that the love that their parents did have conditions. It was no longer unconditional. So we can't just think all the time about the mother, those groups as well, you know.
Yeah, I think it's helping people to recognise their right to grieve, isn't it? You know, and like you're saying, I think sometimes when we talk about that, that will suddenly make something click into place for somebody, and they think, you know, that's why I'm so hurt. I'm not just hurt that my daughter had an abortion. I've lost my grandchild. I've got a right to grieve for myself. Hello and welcome to the second in our mini-series on talking about abortion. Now, in the first of this series, we looked at how before we look at how to talk about abortion, we need to address the point of why it's so important that we do bring this up in our conversations. And so now following on from that, today we're going to look at who do we need to think about when we're having those conversations? What are the groups of people, the kinds of individuals that we need to be aware of when talking about abortion? And there's a key point I want to make, and this is, if you maybe struggle to remember every point from this session, this is something that I'd really like people to go away remembering, is how that we can inadvertently, whilst ministering to one individual or one group of people, we can end up being unhelpful to another group. So we minister to one group at the expense of another. And so hopefully once we've listened to this podcast, it'll maybe make us more aware of our conversations so that we don't do that in the future. And hopefully you'll maybe understand a little bit more of what I mean after I've had this conversation with Rachel. So welcome again, Rachel, from Rachel's Vineyard. Thank you very much for joining me again in this series. So when you're having conversations with abortion, with people about abortion, what's the particular group that maybe first comes to your mind that we need to think about? And obviously this is in no particular order, but any group that you can think of that we need to be aware of when having these conversations?
I think the group that always comes to mind for me, because of Rachel's Vineyard, is those that have had an abortion. And I think when we think about, you know, somebody having an abortion, if we keep going on and talking about an abortion, I often think about the ones that have had multiple abortions, and that's why, you know, when I pick up the phone, I don't presume it's one. I just say, you know, how many abortions have you had? You know, I know we do a lot of training with priests, and we often say to the priests as well, you know, when you're in confession and somebody confesses an abortion, just ask how many. So that's out in the open already, because not only do a lot of post-abortive women and men believe the lie they're not going to be forgiven, there is an even deeper lie that those that have had multiple abortions, well, one abortion was bad enough, but 2, 6, 15, well, that's unforgivable.
That's a really good point, because like you think people might think, oh, I'm being, you know, really understanding by talking about this issue, and not realise that they need to kind of be aware of the fact that there's plenty of people out there who've had more than one abortion, should we say, and that could be, like you say, various amounts of abortions. And a story actually that comes to my mind, Rachel, is a mutual friend of ours, and I know she doesn't mind her name being mentioned, Shannon. You remember Shannon, and she shared her story on March for Life on our website. And in her story, she talked about how she'd had 2 abortions. And I think she was considering coming to Rachel's Vineyard to get some healing from that when she found out she was pregnant again. And immediately, almost maybe out of habit, because this is just like the process that she'd gone through before, she began thinking in panic mode, I'm going to have another abortion. And she shared that with you. And I remember her telling me that when she shared that with you, you said to her, I'm really worried, Shannon, how you'll cope if you have another abortion. And she said that is the only thing that would have made her decide to keep her baby, which is what she did decide to do. And I think that's maybe an important point to bring up here, because sometimes, particularly as people who recognise the humanity of the preborn child, we can be so focused on that we can fail to recognise the importance of that woman who is pregnant and how worried she might be in herself. You know, sometimes we've almost, for people who are pregnant, they can almost, if they decide to have an abortion, they can disconnect from the child. And so they're already not thinking about that child. So pleased to kind of like, recognise the humanity of the child, that can fall on deaf ears. But to recognise that you're still valuable and we still care about you, that can actually be what needs to be awakened in somebody, because they've got really low self-esteem, can't they?
Exactly. And I think you brought up a really good point there of, we've got to think about the women and how this impacts them. But you also mentioned the preborn, didn't you? And we can't dismiss that either.
Yes. And so, of course, that would be another group then, wouldn't it, that needs to be thought of. And it's not just a procedure. And I think sometimes even when I've had conversations with people who very much support the pro-life perspective, we can end up discussing it like it is just a procedure. We're talking about, the process of having an abortion rather than talking about the child, the human being. And sometimes that is the elephant in the room that never gets talked about in discussions on abortion, isn't it, too frequently? Far
too frequently. You see, if we don't use the proper terms, then if we start, saying things like it, this is why so many that come to Rachel's Vineyard end up saying, I got rid of it. So if we can't use the words, if we're not going to value the preborn, then how do we expect other people to as well? So I think it's really important that, we realise that really is a human being. And, when we say procedure, well, it's the only procedure where for the abortion industry, it's a successful procedure if somebody dies. Not something, but someone. Yeah.
That's a hugely important thing. I think that, certainly as pro-lifers, we need to make sure that we focus on the who, not the what of the procedure, don't we?
Absolutely. And thinking about that abortion industry, and that a procedure that the success is if somebody dies. There's another group, the abortion industry. The abortion workers, and also those that were complicit in an abortion. And that actually is me. I've taken people for abortions as well. I've had abortions myself. And so I think that group needs to be thought about as well.
Yeah, I think that's quite an important one to pick up on, really, because I know sometimes in our efforts to recognise how evil the act of having an abortion is, that it's very, very wrong, that we can actually demonise individuals within the abortion industry and make them out to be some sort of monsters. And that's so unhelpful. Whilst the act is terribly wrong, and performing an abortion, encouraging somebody else, all those things are very wrong acts and sinful acts. But it doesn't mean that the person themselves is a monster, and trying to sort of paint them as such is so unhelpful and can be actually really damaging to somebody ever looking at coming away from that and recognising the pro-life perspective.
And I think having the privilege of meeting abortion workers, that have gone public on this, like Kevin Duffy, that we all a really good friend of ours, and Dr. Levitina that I had the privilege of meeting. Hand on heart, I know they're not monsters, and that they believed in many respects the same lie that the people that are going into the abortion industry, going there for an abortion, that they think this is healthcare. They think they're helping women. They're not monsters. They're, the reason they're doing it, even though it's off key of what's real and true and right, they are not monsters. And just like I've always talked about, haven't I, that every abortion story has a backstory, that's the same for the abortion workers as well. They've got the same or similar backstories that led them to become vulnerable to choosing, this is my career.
Yeah, when I've been outside abortion centres, I've managed to, over the years, talk to many people who work in the abortion industry in various ways, whether that's actually the abortionist, anaesthetist, or just somebody answering the phones. And interestingly, every single one of them has told me that they're a Christian. So I think we can almost presume that these are people who have got no values at all. But sometimes they're really confused people who have, like you said, just bought into the lies that society tells them and have managed to somehow sell themselves lives as well, and are recognising their own humanity and recognising some good in them can sometimes help to bring them out of that. And I can certainly think of occasions, where we've, made an effort to reach out to somebody who worked in the abortion industry, and they've actually left because of it. A certain man comes to my mind who I know that we met at, who worked at the abortion centre in Birmingham. We managed to befriend him and talk to him and found out how difficult it was for him working there, because both his wife and his mother worked there, and he said to leave would actually be really difficult for him and cause family problems. In the end, he did find the strength to do that, but it wasn't through us making him out to be a monster. Obviously, we didn't, say that abortion wasn't a terrible thing. We helped him to recognise that, but we helped to build him up, not to put him down.
I think it's like what I've always said to you, I needed to know I was loved before I was ready to look at what I'd done.
Yeah.
That's so important.
Yeah. And another group I think that we need to pick up on is those who either are pregnant now or might be in the future, because I think that is such a key group. And one of the things, when I was talking about earlier, maybe ministering to one group at the expense of another, I think sometimes maybe when I've heard, pastors, priests, talking occasionally about this subject, when this does happen, sometimes they can be very keen to maybe stress God's mercy. And that's really important. They might be thinking about, the people in the congregation or the people that they're talking to who have had an abortion. And so they're sort of talking about how, God's mercy is endless and there's no sin that's unforgivable. If there's actually somebody sitting there who is pregnant, or maybe that person might be pregnant in the future, that can sometimes inadvertently give a green light to them to have an abortion. Oh, well, it's forgivable. God will be merciful. I've had people outside abortion centres say that to me. I know it's the wrong thing, but, God understands. Well, he does understand, but that doesn't mean he condones. That's two very different things. And I think if we overstress God's mercy before somebody understands what justice demands, that can be problematic.
I know that I always say on a Rachel's Vineyard, and when I'm speaking, especially to post-abortive people, that yes, God's mercy is free, but it cost him his life. It's not just, free, like a bargain. It cost him his life. And there is that very fine line. And I find there's always like two camps. There's somebody that beats themselves up to the point that they really believe there's no mercy and they've gone into despair. Then there's another group that, will say, well, I know God's forgiven me. And I often think about a conversation I had on a train with an abortion worker who we got talking about abortion, and she's, and saw it as healthcare and thought she was helping people, and she was also post-abortive. And she actually, when she was talking to me, brought up the fact she was Christian and she'd done nothing wrong. She kept saying, I know I've done nothing wrong, this was healthcare, blah, blah, blah. But when we talked about Jesus and on the cross, and she said, I also know I'm forgiven. And I remember just like, it was a real Holy Spirit moment, because I just remember turning to her and saying, oh, well, if you were forgiven, you must have done something wrong. What did you do wrong? Mm-hmm. And you near enough heard the penny drop. And that was the beginning, of a relationship I built up with this lady. That we have to, if we're sorry or we know we're being forgiven, what is it we did wrong?
And I love the way you did that. You helped her to realise it herself rather than telling her you did something wrong. Yeah. It was helping her to understand what she already knew. Yeah. So any other groups then, Rachel, that come to your mind?
I think also, and I think about those that are struggling, with parenthood, they've got children, and I think we can't just forget that group, that it's not always amazing and wonderful.
Yeah, we can sometimes, in our efforts to recognise children as a blessing, which they obviously very much are, always and everywhere, every single human being is a blessing in some way, we can look at it a bit through rose-tinted glasses, can't we? And make out like, once you have that child, everything's fine, And I can imagine, somebody thinking, well, you're not really connecting with the issue, you're not being real. You can imagine, like, I don't know, a single mum who's got 3 children, number 4's on the way. She might not be feeling it's a real blessing at that moment. Whilst, in some way we need to recognise that child is a blessing. We need to also be real about the hardships that there are and help people to manage those rather than just sort of look like we're being a little bit trite about the issue, I think.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I was a teacher for many years, and seeing the parents, sometimes near enough throwing the children in the classroom, they're that like exasperated by the children. That was real, and it was honest, and it's part of a bigger picture. Yes, they are a joy, they are a blessing, but they're hard work.
Yes,
they're hard work.
Yes. What about those then, Rachel, that are maybe just a bit confused on this issue? And that's going to be maybe the kind of biggest group out there generally, those who maybe aren't quite sure where they stand or think, well, certainly there's some situations where abortion is okay. We really need to be aware of those, don't we, when we're talking about this issue of abortion?
Yeah, without a doubt. And I think March for Life, you do such great work with, you know, the training sessions that you put on that help people to actually be able to discuss that.
Yeah, the Rethink Abortion Days, I know
yeah.
you often help with those, making sure that we hear stories from people who've been affected by abortion. And I think that helps us kind of expand our hearts as well on those days, doesn't it, as well as our minds. And so I think to kind of learn some tactics and have a strategy for when we're talking with those. And that just doesn't come about in, you know, spending 2 minutes looking at a book or whatever. I think sometimes we have to give quality time to learn how to talk about those situations, you know, where we're engaging with somebody who is confused about this issue or in some way supports it. So I think we need to be very much aware of those so that we can prepare for that and be really prepared, you know.
Yeah, prepare our mind and our heart together.
Very much so, yeah. Any other groups, Rachel, that you can think of? Or
yeah, I think of those who are pro-life but are very much afraid or reluctant to actually talk about the issue.
Yes, yeah. That's actually quite a lot of people in the churches, I would say. I mean, obviously, there are, you know, let's be real, there are some people in the churches who've got exceptions with regards to abortion, but there are, you know, quite a lot of people, you know, who recognise abortion is wrong, but just maybe don't do anything really about it. It's maybe more of a sort of label that they give themselves. Yes, I'm pro-life, but no one else would really know about it unless you actually ask them. So I think, you know, maybe trying to find ways to encourage those people and help them to be motivated. I mean, I know sometimes when I'm talking to, you know, like young adults or students who are quite fired up on this issue themselves, you know, I say to them how powerful they are in the pro-life movement, encouraging others. You know, our culture is very youth orientated, isn't it? I think for young people to be aware of that and to use that power that they've got, not just to encourage their peers and ask them to maybe come along to an event with them, you know, invite them to March for Life or to a pro-life spuck chain or whatever it might be that they're taking part in, but to also recognise that that power that they've got in their youth can be used for other groups as well. I mean, I remember years ago when my dad was alive, a young man inviting him to an event. It was a Christian event, but it wasn't one that my dad was planning to go to. But because this young person came and asked my dad to accompany him, it meant so much to him. He was really touched that this young person would want him to attend with him, you know. And so I think, you know, for young people to recognise this, you know, you might be the one that could maybe encourage, and just to say, you know, my dad was very much already supportive of the pro-life position, but there might be people who aren't, and for you to kind of encourage them in that way, that might be the start for them, I think. So, you know, to kind of recognise that. What about then, Rachel? I know this is something that you've talked about before in your you know ministry with Rachel's Vineyard. What about those who are affected by abortion, but you know maybe indirectly, those who haven't you know maybe had an abortion themselves? So I'm thinking of like you know grandparents, aunts, uncles, siblings, all those sorts of groups.
Yeah, I think I really do have the privilege of meeting that group. A couple of things I want to say about that is I remember what comes to mind for me is when we were doing a priest training session, and I explained in a session, I think we were in Scotland, about this woman coming up to me and she really wanted help for her sister. Her sister had an abortion. I remember saying, "Oh, your auntie," and how she didn't even realise, oh my gosh, this has really impacted me. And when I was telling the priest, one of the priests came up afterwards and he was like, "Oh, that's some really good points you made." And he even used his hand, it's always about body language with me, and he went, you know, my brother's wife had an abortion. And I went, "Oh, your uncle?" And it had the same impact. So I remember you being there and he was like, "Oh, yes." So, you know.
Yeah, I think it's helping people to recognise their right to grieve, isn't it? You know, and like you're saying, I think sometimes when we talk about that will suddenly make something click into place for somebody and they think, you know, that's why I'm so hurt. I'm not just hurt that my daughter had an abortion. I've lost my grandchild. I've got a right to grieve for myself. And I just think naming that and being aware of that in our conversations can really help people to work through their own grief, however kind of indirectly that might be.
Without a doubt.
So then a last point for you then, Rachel, as we bring this to an end. What group can you think of that maybe we haven't mentioned so far? Anyone else?
I think men. I think men is a group that we often don't think about. And, when I think about them at Rachel's Vineyard, there's so many reasons why they're there, whether they've coerced their girlfriends or their wives, or they didn't have a voice, or actually they did have a voice but they weren't listened to. Though that group, I've the deepest love for this group. When they come and their tears are not only sacred and needed, it's so healing for the women and the grandparents and everybody else that, there. Because at the end of the day, this hurts men too.
And going back to that point that I made at the beginning about how we can, minister to one group and not realising that we're actually maybe not being helpful to another group. Yeah. I think particularly this can happen if we forget to recognise the importance of men in this issue. So, for instance, and I don't want to be misquoted on this. I know, last year the Catholic Bishops' Conference, they had a theme which was "Listen to Her," which was actually a really helpful theme to have because it enabled lots of priests around the country to talk about this issue and using testimonies from women that had been hurt by abortion. To make people more aware of the damage that it does. So that was actually a really helpful theme to have. But even with that, sometimes it could be used in the wrong way. So I know some men who would be thinking, oh, nobody wants to listen to me, that it's all about just listening to her. And maybe that was the problem to start with, that they didn't speak up because they thought that their opinion wasn't valid. Or maybe they tried to speak up and nobody listened to them, and it can almost impact that grief that they've got. Yeah. So I think, whilst we do need to recognise that sometimes abortions can happen because men don't play their part, sometimes they can happen in spite of that. Exactly. Men really, and I've seen a man being arrested because he tried to, encourage his girlfriend to continue a pregnancy. I've certainly seen them on their knees begging girlfriends outside the abortion centre. And that's a really heartbreaking sight to see. So I think being aware, like you say, of the different ways that men are affected by abortion. And I think maybe the last point I would make then, Rachel, is those who are very much on the periphery of this topic, but are still going to be affected when we talk about abortion. So just to give some examples of what I mean, I know sometimes when I've had conversations about abortion, it's unexpectedly brought things up for people. So it might be maybe somebody who's had a miscarriage, which is obviously very different from an abortion, but it can still bring up quite an emotional reaction. Or maybe somebody who's just lost a child at a later stage of, when they're, in childhood or even in adulthood, suddenly something gets triggered. And also even those who want children, but either aren't able to have them, or maybe you've never been an opportunity, maybe they've never met the right person and so they couldn't have children. And all of those people can sometimes be touched by this issue of abortion, and it can be quite a sensitive subject. So I think we really need to be aware of them as well, don't we, when we're having these conversations on abortion?
Yes, I always think when I think of that group and my auntie, that so desperately wanted children. And actually, some of her nieces only the other week came up to her that are actually for abortion. And they said, oh, it's terrible, isn't it, what Trump's doing? And for once in her life, she was able to go, well, I'm actually pro-life. And then she ended the conversation with, how offensive do you think this is to me, who always wanted children, to know that there's people having abortions? And it was so good that she could share that with me. And it just makes me always think of that group that often get dismissed or forgotten.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's really given me a lot to think about, some of those different groups. And I think, I know a lot of us can maybe have a particular group that's on our heart that we particularly care about, maybe because it's a position we've been in or something that's affected us personally. So I think maybe being aware of all of those groups can make our conversations much more rounded. And I really want to encourage those of you who are watching or listening to this to maybe, broaden out those groups that you might think of when you're having your conversations, to make sure that the words that we use aren't words that hurt, but actually can help heal in these situations. But also, we don't want this to bring fear to people and to not have those conversations, because beyond and above anything else, the worst thing is our silence on this issue. So please do start bringing this up in conversations if you haven't already. And if you have, think more about those different groups to make sure that the words that you use are as effective as possible. So tune into our podcast on whatever channels that you watch it, share them, like them, and make sure that you join us next time as we'll actually look at how we can have really effective conversations on abortion.